Today's story is a spooky mystery out of China. A 61-year-old man named Xian Tiesheng finished getting dressed inside of the bedroom that he shared with his wife in the city of Beijing, China. He kind of tiptoed around the bed to his wife's side to give her a kiss goodbye. Xian was going to be heading out to a local mountain that day for a day hike. He accidentally wakes her up and he tells her, hey, I'll be back tonight before midnight. He basically spent all of his off time out in nature going for hikes. I mean, that was his thing. And today, Xian was especially excited about his hike because he was hiking one of his favorite trails. It was located on Mount Miaofeng, and this mountain was quite famous because of all the sacred and ancient temples that kind of dotted the mountain all over the place. And so Xian eventually made it to the train station, he bought his ticket, he boarded his train, and then he sat down in a seat, and as soon as he did, he opened up his bag and pulled out a stack of papers. For this hike, Xian had packed himself some food and water inside of his backpack. He also packed a newspaper called the Beijing Youth Daily, and he brought along his diary. He would bring a newspaper with him on a hike, and as he walked, he would take out a page periodically and tie it to a tree, kind of marking his way. That way, when he turned around and came back down, he would have his path marked. And then finally, right around 7 a.m., that bus would come to a stop in the tiny village of Qianfang, which is located right at the base of Mount Miaofeng, and then began walking through the village towards the mountain. And then by about 7:20 a.m., so not long after Xian had left the bus, he was almost up to Mount Miaofeng when he pulled out his cell phone and he called his cousin. It was a brief conversation, and then only a couple minutes later, Xian disappeared into the beautiful forests of Mount Miaofeng. So Xian's wife did not expect to hear from Xian at any point that day, but she did expect her husband to be home on time. This guy was never late, but the next morning when she woke up, Xian was not in bed. And so that day, the family went to the police and they reported Xian missing. The local police immediately organized a search for Xian, and at the same time, the police were also in contact with Xian's cell phone service provider to see if they could track down Xian's cell phone. But the only way a cell phone can be tracked is if the cell phone is on. They were able to pull all of Xian's cell phone signal history up until his phone was turned off. And what they found in this signal history is the day before, so the day Xian went missing, his cell phone was on at 4 p.m. that evening, and he received a phone call. And the service provider was able to see that when this phone call came in, Xian's cell phone was not where they thought it would be. It was not high up Mount Miaofeng. It actually was near the base of the mountain. They discovered it was just a friend of Xian's, and this friend said that Xian said he was coming down the mountain now and he'd be home soon. But now, based on this phone call, it sounded an awful lot like Xian was not even on the mountain when he disappeared. So where was he? And there was another problem. Members of Xian's family told the police about Xian's habit. There should be markers up on that mountain, literally leading searchers to wherever Xian went. But after an entire day of searching Mount Miaofeng, they didn't find a single newspaper anywhere. So 1 week after Xian had vanished, Xian's cell phone service provider noticed that Xian's cell phone had suddenly turned back on. It was located 36 miles away from the mountain at a train station called Beijing West Railway Station. But when they got there, Xian was not there, his phone was not there, and on this day, at basically the same time that police are at this railway station trying to make sense of, what's going on with the cell phone, a villager from Qianfang village, which is that little village that sits at the base of Mount Miaofeng, came forward with a very strange story. He said on the day that Xian disappeared, this villager was at his little shop. He sold walnuts to hikers that were making their way towards Mount Miaofeng, and he sees this guy walking up through the village towards the mountain, and he looked exactly like Xian, because now Xian's face was on the news and this villager had seen it, and so he felt like he had seen Xian. And so this villager said, this guy who looked exactly like Xian, he walked up and actually stopped at this villager's shop to buy some walnuts. And this villager and this man who looked like Xian, they just chatted for a few minutes, and at some point asked the villager, hey, these are great, but where else can I buy walnuts? I want to buy other types of walnuts and bring them back to my family. And so this villager was like, oh yeah, well, the best walnuts in all of Beijing are actually located about 30 miles away at the base of another mountain. It's called Tietua Mountain. And then after the villager said this, it's like everything changed for him. It's like his expression changed, his tone changed. It's like he's been given this information that's changed his life, about these walnuts. And he says to the villager, okay, I'm going to go there right now. And without saying anything else, this man just turned and began quickly walking away from the walnuts, back through town, back towards the bus stop. So away from Mount Miaofeng. In theory, this guy is going to the bus to what? Commute 30 miles to this other mountain, Tietua Mountain, to get these walnuts? I mean, the villager does not know this guy, but even he felt like this is bizarre. They would learn that Jian did not have a special interest in walnuts, and neither did his family. He would not have had time in that day to take the bus 30 miles to Tietua Mountain, get these walnuts, go 30 miles back, and hike up Mount Miaofeng, because he can't stay the night. He needs to come back tonight in order to go to his mother's birthday party the next day. So it just made no sense. And so they decided to shift their search area from Mount Miaofeng to Tietua Mountain. They found pages from the Beijing Youth Daily newspaper tied to trees on the mountain. And when they looked more closely at the newspapers, they found the publication date of this newspaper lined up with the copy that Jian would have had with him on the day he vanished. For 2 days, searchers very diligently followed this trail up the mountain. They eventually found something. The newspapers led them to a campsite. Now, the campsite was abandoned, but there was a bed of hay, there were some used water bottles, and some toilet paper, and so it seemed pretty likely, based on everything else, that this was Jian's campsite. And pretty quickly, after searching the campsite, they found something that virtually guaranteed that this was his campsite. Authorities found this plastic bag that was sitting next to the bed, and inside of the bag was a piece of scrap paper from Beijing No. 5 Middle School. And on this scrap paper was a note. And the note said Jian had indeed hiked up Tietua Mountain on September 30th. This would have been the day that he left, so the day he disappeared. And then on his way down, he said he got lost and was forced to spend the night out here. And so that explained the campsite. And then on October 1st, so that would have been the day after he spent the night out here, he said he was going to attempt to follow the ridge line down the mountain to a nearby village to safety. And this note ended with the phrase, "Leaving this note here just in case. Love to everyone who passes by." Now, at first glance, this note was like amazing news because suddenly it seemed totally possible that Jian was just fine. But as the police analyzed this note, they noticed that some things were off about it. First of all, this note basically directly contradicts other facts of this case. Remember, cell phone records prove Jian got a phone call at 4 p.m. on the day he went missing from his friend, and his friend would report that Jian told him that he was coming down Mount Miaofeng and he'd be home soon. But according to the note they found, that was not possible, because the note said the day he went missing, he would have been on Tietua Mountain, either hiking up or being in the process of getting lost and, ultimately making that campsite where he camped out for at least one night. Another issue with the note was just the way it was written. Now, Jian's wife had a chance to look at the note, and she would say, "That is my husband's handwriting." But the note contained a bunch of very strange language choices that just didn't make sense for Jian to be using. And so it really should have been written in the first person. But the note was written in the third person. Jian got lost on the mountain, and so he is going to camp out for the night, and tomorrow he's going to make his way out to safety. But despite being written in the third person, it did sound like somebody was talking about themselves. It did not feel like somebody else was attempting to document what Jian was doing. But by far, the weirdest part of this note was the tone shift that happened about halfway through. So the first half of this letter was written, albeit in the third person, but it was grammatically correct and sort of formal. But once you get to that second half of the note, the grammar started being really awkward. And then the very final line, which says, "Love to everyone who passes by," that actually sounds totally awkward in Chinese. It would be like if I tried to say to you, "I take the bus to work," but instead I said, "To work, take bus." And so this last line stood out so much that actually police and friends and family of Jian assumed he must have left that in there as like a secret message or a code, like a distress signal, especially when you consider the other weird factors around this note. But nobody could figure out what it meant. The day after this note was discovered, A searcher was up in the vicinity of Xian's campsite on Tietua Mountain, and up ahead they noticed there was this tree kind of hanging out over this rocky cliff, and dangling from the tree was something gray that looked sort of out of place. It was a pair of sweatpants that had clearly been intentionally tied to this branch in the tree. And so the searcher, he reached up and grabbed one of the pant legs and kind of tugged on it, and when he did, all these white things began falling out of the pants and landing on the ground. And when the searcher stopped and looked down to see what they were, he couldn't believe it. It was a whole pile of human bones. However, they were not Xian's. In fact, nobody ever figured out who these bones belonged to or why they were stuffed inside of pants and tied to a tree on this mountain. But the discovery of these bones would open up a whole new mystery, because after these bones were found, all the searchers came over and basically just began combing the area near these bones, and the police began uncovering body after body after body. They found 2 more sets of human bones stuffed into pants and tied to trees, and they found the other bodies at the foot of a cliff, and also inside of this well, and inside of this cave. And so in total, authorities found 10 sets of human remains in the vicinity near Xian's campsite, but none of the human remains belonged to Xian. Officials were only able to identify a few of the bodies, and they were not able to figure out how they died or whether or not foul play was involved. But the discovery of those bodies did mean one thing for Xian's case. It meant, all these people had previously gone up Tietua Mountain before Xian went up and vanished. And when these other people went up the mountain, clearly something horrible happened to them, and we don't know what it is. Is there a killer on the loose? Is there some animal or creature out there that's taken people out? I mean, we don't know. But what started to happen since Xian went missing and his story was all over the news in China is that all these other hikers who've been on Tietua Mountain before have begun sharing their experiences when they hiked up Tietua Mountain, and some of their stories about what they've seen on that mountain are horrifying. One person said they were walking up the mountain, they had their partner with them who was a little bit farther back the trail, and so they're kind of walking up on their own, and the first person, as they're walking up the trail, suddenly sees this guy just kind of come out of nowhere wielding an axe, and he walks up to this person, and all he says is, "Are you alone?" And the hiker's like, "No, my partner's back there, they're coming up here, what's going on?" But the axe man, he basically acted like he didn't even hear their answer, and he just asked it again, "Are you alone?" And the hiker was like, "No, my partner's back there." And the axe man again just said, "Are you alone? Are you alone? Are you alone?" And this axe person kept doing that until the hiker and their partner just turned and ran. And then another hiker shared a story about how they were walking up a trail on Tietua Mountain, and at some point they lifted their head up, and he saw a little ways up the trail, kind of off the trail, so in the tree line, were all these people, like this group of strangers, just standing there motionless, kind of half behind trees, like they were kind of trying to hide themselves, but also not. And they were just staring at this hiker, unmoving, not speaking, just staring. And so the hiker, they look up and they see this, and they were so unnerved so quickly that they just turned and left. The official search for Xian was called off at the end of October, so roughly 1 month after he vanished. But unofficially, the search for Xian continues to this day. However, they still have not found his body, and basically no real progress has been made.